Apple has upended a lot of industries over the years, and it is about to upend yet another one. Square is a company that has been making a lot of money. Same guy that ran Twitter also started Square. What's Apple doing? This is a real big deal. Apple has been for a long time upending industries. You might remember, of course, the music player. In fact, I still have an old MP3 player. You can't really see it very well from this angle, but it's right over there in that shelf. And it was a 5 gigabyte player, just amazing. The thing was huge. It was actually designed by Digital Equipment Corporation, licensed by this other manufacturer, put them together. Great audio quality. They had these little Koss headphones that came along with it. Loved the thing. Absolutely loved it. And Apple came along. They weren't the first, and they introduced their own MP3 player. It was called an iPod, and it did very well. It just slaughtered everybody else. You might remember that Microsoft came out with their Zoon, and many others came out with their own little MP3 players. Nobody could touch our friends over at Apple with their iPod. And then what happened? Around 2010. Think for a minute. What new product did Apple introduce around 2010? Of course, it was this, right? It was the iPhone. Now, the iPhone cut dramatically into Apple's market, and for a good reason. It was a phone. It was a smartphone. It could play all of your music. I still have and still use a 120 gigabyte iPod, yeah. It's kind of the classic, I think is what they had called it. And 120 was just amazing. Just that much music. And of course, I have a lot of lectures, a lot of audiobooks and other things I listen to on those iPods. And what happened? Well, of course, now you can get these iPhones with a terabyte of memory in them. Just incredible amount of space. And that's a pretty good thing, frankly, because you can store everything. But at the same time, our networks are getting faster, aren't they? So our networks, like what we have for our cellular phones and stuff, are faster than they have ever been. So you don't really need as much storage, do you, as you used to have on your phone or your iPod or your MP3 player. So it's an interesting game. How much space do you need? And I'm asked that all of the time. And the newest iPhones coming out have a lot more memory. I think they have 8 gigabytes of RAM in them. And as I said, a terabyte of storage space. But what Apple was doing is saying, hey, we own this iPod market, the MP3 player market. And of course, it's more than just MP3s. A lot of other formats out there for the music or audiobooks. But they owned it. But they knew that if they were going to survive in the industry, they had to do something else. Came out with a product that competed with their award-winning and just top-of-the-line product, the iPhone. And your iPhone works every bit as well as an iPod ever did. And, of course, ever so much better, because now you don't have to download the music onto your iPhone to listen to it, do you? You can stream it over the internet, over Wi-Fi, right, over the cellular data connection. Those things have gotten fast too. Great option for what Apple's doing now is saying we need to upend another market. Have you ever had, again, you got your phone, right? And let's say you're a small merchant. Maybe you're a coffee shop, or maybe you're even smaller. Maybe you're just out at a flea market selling stuff that you might want to peddle. You have to get a credit card reader, don't you? And back in the day, that credit card reader would plug right into the headphone jack, and with the headphone jack, you'd be able to go online, no problem. Life is good. And once you're online, then you can take the credit card. Now, you didn't just have to go online with your iPhone, but you had to be able to go online with your phone and the reader. Because when they got rid of that wonderful little headphone port, you now had to use Bluetooth, didn't you? You still do. So you get that reader from Square or that reader from PayPal or somewhere else. It's acting as your merchant account. And that reader then uses Bluetooth to talk to the phone, and then it can read the credit card or the chip. And of course, with the chip, it's bidirectional. It has to get the information to and from that chip reader. And then you've got the credit card that you can process. All well and good. We're all happy about that. But here's your next problem. Your Bluetooth isn't always working. That reader has to be charged. Did you charge it before you brought it, before you started using it? So Apple said, well, wait a minute. In our iPhones, we have built in a few different things. Have you ever used Apple Pay? It's probably the safest way to pay online, bar none. It doesn't actually give the merchant the credit card number. It gives them a code that they can redeem in order to go ahead and get the money from the transaction. So that transaction can then be redeemed by the merchant. And that's all stuff handled by your merchant account. You don't have to worry about it. It makes life simple. However, now what they've done is they've said, well, let's reverse this. You can use your iPhone with Apple Pay in order to pay for things. And it has what's called near-field technology in it that allows it to act like those tap-and-go credit cards. Have you ever used one of those where you can just tap it and it makes the transaction happen? Pretty simple. So it has that in there, but it also has the ability to read those tap-and-go transactions. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly what happens here. This is a very big industry. There is a whole lot of money in it. And there's an article this week from our friends over in Inc. Magazine. I got up on my screen for those who are watching a video here on Rumble or YouTube. And it's talking about this feature that they introduced quite quietly, because this new capability is going to change things. Now, you are still going to have your merchant account. So you still might have to have a Stripe or a PayPal or a direct merchant account with your bank. But this is allowing contactless credit and debit cards and other digital wallets to be able to be read from anyone's iPhone, which is really quite cool. Now, there's things like Venmo and others out there that people use. My kids use a lot more than I do. But they use it to send money back and forth to each other. It's a pretty good little thing that they've got going. But with something like this, you wouldn't even need to use a Venmo. So those are the guys that are going to get really nailed by it. And Stripe really is phenomenal. It's so easy to use, and I use it as well. For my courses, if you sign up for a course, it's almost always going through Stripe. I know there's some other alternatives out there right now that are a little more friendly to the non-mainstream, but I haven't been able to integrate those yet in for my payment processors. But you're still going to need it. You can use Cash App, Venmo. It's not going to stop you from doing any of that, but it does stop you from having to have another piece of equipment with you, which is just something else to go bad or to have get dirty, to not be able to work for you. So we'll see what happens. This is cutting out these companies like Square. They'll no longer be able to have from the front to the back. They'll still have the back, frankly, but they'll be able to accept payments from pretty much anything that's contactless, which is, I think, a very good deal. We'll see what happens. But again, this is not Apple going after Apple's existing customer base like it did with the iPod transition to the iPhone. This is Apple going after another piece of the retail space. And remember what I said earlier, it's not even just that Apple has the ability to enter market. But we've seen time and again where Apple enters a market that's already established. It's not quite mature, right? You haven't had all of those acquisitions going where the companies are buying each other up. But it is going to make a huge difference because, again, Apple upending it. And Apple has ties in to a couple of banks that they use for processing their Apple cards. I think it's Goldman Sachs. And they could potentially provide you with the merchant account stuff on the back end. So I think that's pretty cool, and it's going to allow us all to have a cashless society. Yeah, if this was a political show, that's probably what we'd be talking about, wouldn't it? Because there's certain problems with doing that as well. Hey, I want to invite everybody to take a few minutes right now. I am making some changes. I've been working on some of these for weeks, but I've got a lot of clients I've got to take care of first, right? I've been doing a lot of CISO work, CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, just on a fractional or part-time basis as a contractor for a few different companies to try and keep them up to date with all of the latest in technology. So it's been really fun, but I haven't been able to do everything I want to do yet on the radio show. So my wife and I are reaching into our pockets, and we're going to be hopefully pulling out somebody to help us with some of this, because what I want to do is send my show notes to you guys every week so you can see what I'm talking about. You have the direct links as well as my newsletter, and I want to start doing my Wednesday Wisdoms trainings more regularly. It's really hit or miss. So trying to do all of that, and I'd really appreciate it if you would go right now to craigpeterson.com and make sure you sign up right there for my email list. craigpeterson.com. Get it all right there. We've been very worried about China for quite a few years for more than one reason. But one of the biggest is they have dominated some of the most critical markets in the world, including some of these mineral resources that we need. China has been a big worry for many countries around the world for a long time. I met with the ambassador from a couple of these African countries and had a great little chat about what was going on there. They wanted to become, this one country in particular, the data processing center for Africa. And Africa, of course, very big country, or continent, I should say, with a lot of countries and a lot of financial transactions. And they figured what we need is a good data center. We need data lines coming in. And so they got some of those data lines, and they got the data center provided by our friends in China. And so this data center was being used for a few different things, but it sure was not being used for these financial transactions that they wanted it to be used for, because China's provided the equipment. And we know from a lot of articles, a lot of research, and from the federal government that China has been spying on us. And I have seen it personally with some of these DoD subcontractors. In other words, not necessarily directly contracting with the Department of Defense, but providing parts and things via subcontractor relationships. So China's a problem. So what do? How is this small African country supposed to become the data processing country for all of Africa with Chinese equipment? Well, how could they possibly do it without Chinese equipment? And that's what the ambassador was telling. We need this equipment. This is it. They had Chinese routers, switches, processors. They had racks of equipment set up in virtual environments, and they were all set to go. China's been doing similar things in other parts of the world, where they come in, they might build a port, for instance, which has happened many times. One in Indonesia, particularly, I'm thinking of, and they finance the port. If you don't make the payment on that data center, or the payment on the port, or the payment on the railroad system, etc., that China has installed in your country, guess what's in that contract? You forfeit them. So the data center now becomes absolutely China's. Not just a lien on it, not just a lease from China. It is China's data center. That port is China's port. In fact, they own the largest port now, I think, in all of Indonesia. Maybe the whole Pacific Rim over there, I'm not sure. But That's what they've been doing. Same thing with railroads, et cetera, et cetera. So China really has a lot of companies and countries over the barrel. That's something we didn't want to have happen here. And President Trump, you might remember, was very adamant about it. He did a whole lot of work to make sure that none of the Chinese interests would really be able to take over and control our U.S. interests. Makes sense to me. So what has China been doing to us? We know about the steel. Remember, China was dumping cheap steel into the U.S. and world markets. That hurts us. We have a need to make things here. If we ever, heaven forbid, got into a war again, and we needed ships or boats or planes, or we needed armaments of some sort or another, we need to be able to make them in the United States or in an allied country. You remember how many problems that Britain had during the war trying to ship stuff over. I have 2 kids that were merchant mariners, and the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy is the only of the military academies that flies battle standards because they lost cadets who were there at the school during warfare. Okay, it's a bad thing. We don't want that to happen. So not having to rely on other countries actually ends up being a bit of a positive thing, depending on what it is. China's sent us things like dog food that's contaminated, baby food contaminated, even those green recyclable bags people take to the grocery store, contaminated with lead. It goes on and on. They also had control of 99% of certain precious metals that are needed for some of our key manufacturing here in the U.S. So we put tariffs on China for steel. We did the same thing in 2021. In fact, they put a tariff of 23% in 2021 to protect the steel manufacturers here in the U.S. from these cheap Chinese imports. Not just cheap, but low-quality steel. Huawei, you know about them. They owned the smartphone business in many parts of the world. In fact, here in the United States, you could get cheap Huawei phones. Now, Huawei, of course, if much about Canadian history, know about Northern Telecom, who did a lot of pioneering in the whole phone business for many decades. And the allegations, and there's some proof that I've seen that leads me to believe that these allegations are correct, are that Huawei stole Northern Telecom's designs, its plans, etc., and put all of that together to make Huawei. So they steal the plans, they steal the engineering, they steal the research and development, the intellectual property. They then start making it, of course, without having to worry about the investments into R&D and developing products. No, they just stole them. And then they flood the markets worldwide with cheap equipment, paid and manufactured in some cases by slave labor, and in almost every case by substantially low wages, and they then control the market. So we said no way to Huawei, and that was something President Trump started. It's actually a really good thing. And Google apps are now no longer allowed on Huawei phones. So China used to have a 99% almost total monopoly on rare earth metals. I'm going to bring this article up on the screen from our friends over at American Thinker. But now they have fallen to less than 60% monopoly. So they've been trying to stop shipments of rare earth metals to countries all over the world to drive up the prices. They did the same thing here to Japan because of the contesting in the South China Sea of some of these islands and some of these mineral rights. But since then, in the last decade, rare earth metals are being mined in other parts of the world. We talked here about what California is doing. California is now going to be mining lithium and some of these other rare earth metals that we need to make batteries, we need to make processors, we need to make cars, we need to make light bulbs, right? On and on. They used to have a near monopoly on foreign offshore investment because companies were going to China like crazy because of cheap wages over there. 1.4 billion consumers has been leading companies that make movies like Disney to go over to China. But things have really stopped in some of these growth areas for China and, in fact, have reversed in a very big way. They're clamped down on business, censoring of wealthy capitalists, food shortages, centralized government corruption, corruption, mismanagement, stagflation, plunging birth rate, all resulted in investments and opportunities fleeing China. Great article in American Thinker. Keep an eye out for it in the newsletter this week. And stick around. But first, check out craigpeterson.com. Make sure you're on my email list. And if you like watching video, hey, I'd like to invite you to watch me and follow me on YouTube and Rumble. This is straight out of the What Were You Thinking department. In fact, what are you thinking? Yeah, the U.S. Army is planning on going green. Yeah, they want electric vehicles in war. This is a plan that you just are going to have to shake your head at. Again, it's a little bit of idiocy. But before we talk specifically about the plan, I want to talk about something related. Now, remember, this plan is from the U.S. Army, and they want some goals reached on climate change and electric vehicles here over the next 20, 30 years. So let's look at the science behind what they're talking about. And I'm going to show you the actual statement that came out from the military, and one of President Biden's appointees is just nuts, absolute nuts. But I'm going to back up a little bit here. For those of you who are watching along at home, let me pull this up for you. This is from Slashdot, and it's quoting a report over on the Wall Street Journal and pulling some stuff together. But what they're doing in this particular article is talking about how our friends who have come up with these supercomputer designs to model our weather have been befuddled. They've reworked 1.2 million lines of computer code in order to compensate for something that, I don't know about you, but if I was writing the code, I probably would have compensated for it in the first place. Clouds. Yeah. It turns out, this is just, to me, absolute boggling the mind. That great glowing orb that appears in the sky from time to time, give or take half of the day, that thing called the sun apparently has something to do with the earth warming up. And do you know what else does? The clouds that are up in the sky, those clouds can reflect the sun's heat, and they can also hold heat in on the ground side. Who would have thought? So all of these models that they've been using, because remember, by now, as of more than a decade ago, New York, Manhattan is underwater. Remember, Al Gore with his scientific movie, The Science is Decided, it's proven. And Florida by now is underwater, and so is Manhattan. And of course, neither is true because they had no idea what they were talking about. This article in the Wall Street Journal just totally baffles me. And I'm just showing you the excerpt from Slashdot here on the screen because the Wall Street Journal is paid, and I don't want to have to push you guys to paid stuff if I can avoid it. But they thought it was really strange because they updated the simulation in 2018, and in 2018 it turned out that the Earth was way more sensitive to greenhouse gases than they thought. And, oh man, they had to think about that because in Boulder, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, they said if that number was correct, that would be really bad news. Yeah. And at least 20 older climate models disagreed with the new one, but they were simpler. And this new one is an open source model, so anybody can look at the code and kind of figure it out. So then what ended up happening is more than a dozen other models were released, and it turns out, wait a minute now, they're agreeing with us. Do you remember that spaghetti code that predicted the COVID-19 was going to kill, what was it, 2.5 million people in the United States? Of course, didn't get anywhere near close to that because the way we kept the stats, right? Dying with COVID versus because of COVID, right? Remember that whole controversy? Well, it turns out that the scientists concluded that their new calculations have been thrown off kilter by the physics of clouds in a warming world, which may amplify or damp climate change. Isn't that what I had just said? The clouds, they can block the sun, and they can also keep heat in. A night with lots of moisture in the air, whether it's humidity or clouds, is going to stay warmer than a night where there's no clouds. These are experts, so the fact that they left out clouds and the effect they might have must make a whole lot of sense, because this is the science, and the science is settled. Yeah. So Andrew Gettleman, a physicist there in Boulder, said that the old way is just wrong. We know that. I think our higher sensitivity is wrong too. It's probably a consequence of other things we did by making clouds better and more realistic. You solve one problem and create another. I got to point out, science is not settled on pretty much anything, and it never has been. And until we are all knowing, it never will be. So keep that in mind and quit having your heads just be so inflated that you think that you're absolutely right. Because I'm not absolutely right. They're not absolutely right. No one's absolutely right. So let's get into the Army here, okay? This is just so exciting because Christine Wormuth is the Secretary of the Army now. And the Army is going to lead by example. Let me put this up on the screen. I just realized I don't have this up on the screen for you guys. We will use our buying power to drive change in the industry and leverage best practices from many sources. There's another great quote here from the Secretary of Defense. We face all kinds of threats in our line of work. Yeah. Secretary of Defense, Army, yeah, okay. But few of the threats truly deserve to be called existential. The climate crisis does. Climate change is making the world more unsafe, and we need to act. Right? That's what she's saying. This thing goes on for pages, what the goals are. So I decided, okay, Craig, let's have a look at this. I'm going to do a search in this PDF for the word risk. What are the risks? If we're going to be messing with the military, with the electric vehicles, because in the middle of a war zone, it's great. You stop, you plug your electric vehicle in, you let it charge for half an hour, and then you're off and running. And particularly where tanks are, right, where we're trying to protect our personnel, maybe have an offensive, they'll wait while we charge our tanks, right? Oh, and a little tiny solar cell, or we cover it with solar cells, that's going to be enough to charge it if we leave it sitting there for a week. So we're okay. So what are the risks associated with us being idiots and moving towards an electric army? Okay, so risks here. Okay, so this is a risk to the climate. This is climate risk. Oh, this is mitigating climate risks associated with climate change, risks impacting the Army at all levels, from how and where units operate and train to how to service as a whole. Okay, so that's risks of when the climate changes, as we know it will, because those guys wrote 1.2 million new lines of code. Okay, so we know it's going to change. Okay, so let me see. Risk climate change imposes, climate threats and risks, address the risks associated with these. Let's see here. What else have we got? Climate change risks. Climate change risks. Oh, they're going to install microgrids on every installation. Okay. Climate change risks. This is nuts. And the New York Post has a great article on this insanity. Oh my gosh. What are we going to do with these people? Yeah, our military, we're going to stop and charge our vehicles. Yeah. All right, everybody, stick around and visit online, craigpeterson.com. I'll keep you up to date. We're going to talk about this Bitcoin laundering case that really turned the internet upside down. Cryptocurrencies? Bitcoin? How safe is it? How secure is it really? And what happened here? Because this Bonnie and Clyde failed. This is an article from the New York Times. Now, I know I don't like to, you guys know this, show you stuff that you have to go to a paid site, and particularly something like the New York Times. It's amazing to me how they have some really great journalists that do a good job on some of these stories, and then they just totally go political on so many of the other stories. And I'm not talking about the editorial page, knock yourself out, but anyways, this is a fascinating story to me because so many of us think that using Bitcoin is going to be safe. After all, cryptocurrency, and crypto means cryptography, and cryptography means we're keeping ourselves safer. Isn't that how that's all supposed to work? Kind of the bottom line. Well, in reality, it doesn't always work out that way. And when it comes to cryptocurrency, it definitely doesn't. I want to explain a little bit about cryptocurrency for people if you don't understand it very well. Just putting the very, very basically, the way it works is there are ledgers, just like the old ledgers you used to see at the banks or businesses, those big books, and they'd maybe do double entry ledgers or maybe some other types. Nowadays, of course, all of the stuff is done on computers. But the idea is you walk into your bank and you say, I want $100 from my account. So the bank opens up its ledgers and sees, okay, your account has X dollars in it. They give you $100 in that ledger now. They mark down that your account now is $100 less because you just withdrew $100. That's the simple way it works with the bank. It's actually very similar with these cryptocurrencies. But what happens in cryptocurrencies is you're not dealing with one institution. So it isn't just your retirement plan at Fidelity, for instance. When it comes to cryptocurrencies, these ledgers are maintained by hundreds of different businesses and people around the world, thousands, depends on the cryptocurrency itself. And the idea is when you go and you want to take your $100, for instance, from the bank, they look it up in their one ledger, and that ledger is assumed to be correct. But when it comes to cryptocurrencies, there have to be majority of ledgers that agree about how much money you have. And those ledgers are all public ledgers. So it's like having a Swiss bank account in that your account is represented by a number. That's actually where the cryptography comes in and the keys, public keys and everything else. But your account is essentially represented by a number. So if you want to pay the $100 to someone in cryptocurrency, so it's probably some fraction of some cryptocurrency, what's going to happen is you are going to have half of the ledgers for that particular cryptocurrency agree that you're transferring $100 worth from account number 1234 to someone else's account, which is 5678, just as an example, very simplified example. So now what happens is the people who are running the ledger that you're using, the main ledger, check the other ledgers and push your transaction onto the ledgers. That's why it takes a while for cryptocurrency transactions to occur, because it has to push out to these ledgers. Half of them have to agree in order for it to be a reasonable and accepted transaction. Does that make sense? Good. So what we have here now, because of public ledgers, is public information. The amount of money you have in that numbered account can be seen by anyone who cares to look. It's really that simple. Anybody can see it. So why are people thinking that it's crypto, it's safe, it can't be taken by the government or bad guys, etc.? Those concepts are all insane. The only sort of privacy or security you have is related to the ledger. So the security is half of the ledgers have to agree. So if someone hacks one ledger, that's not enough to get control of all of your cryptocurrency, whatever it might be. If someone hacks your wallet, that's a different story entirely, okay? That's not what we're talking about right now. But everybody can see that you have $100 in account number 1234. The trick is, and the problem for law enforcement, they don't necessarily know who owns account 1234. So what law enforcement does in order to get money back or to arrest people is they watch these accounts. So in this particular case, this Bonnie and Clyde, if you will, hacked a cryptocurrency exchange. So this is, again, one of these ledger sites, and they'll often exchange US dollars for various cryptocurrencies. Back in 2016, Bitfinex, it was the name of it. And they stole $71 million in Bitcoin from effectively wallets that are there on that site. But because these trades are publicly visible, people on the internet knew that it happened. In fact, people on the internet were watching that wallet, waiting for money to move. And this couple that's alleged to have stolen, it's Ilya Lichtenstein and Heather Morgan. That account, they could see that $71 million was in it. But over time, 6 years later, the value of Bitcoin had gone up substantially. And today is worth about $4 billion. Isn't that just amazing? A lot of money. So they moved it to another account, and that's when they got in trouble. So if you have a Swiss bank account, 1234, and you transfer money to someone else that I know, I now can trace that account. I say, oh, I know who has that money. Yeah, that 71 million worth of Bitcoin back in the day that's now worth 4 billion was in this account. And they just bought themselves a new Porsche Cayenne at this dealership. And all law enforcement has to do is knock at the dealership, say who was it, and now they know who the people are. But in this particular case, the bad guys had left that money in that Bitcoin account. But that money did get transferred. But guess what? It wasn't them. People on the internet were thinking that the hackers had emerged, that they were transferring the money to other Bitcoin accounts, which you see fairly frequently for these illegal transactions. But it wasn't the hackers who moved that stolen Bitcoin. This is, again, from the New York Times. It was the government, which had seized it as part of investigation into two New York City entrepreneurs. One with a little-known Russian emigre and tech investor, who I just named. The other, his wife, an American businesswoman and would-be social media influencer with an alter ego, was a satirical rapper named Razzle Khan. Amazing. You can't make this stuff up, can you? So they're charged with conspiracy to launder billions of dollars in Bitcoin. Ilya is 34 and Heather's 31, accused of siphoning off chunks of this currency, trying to hide it in this complex network of digital wallets, internet personas. And if they're convicted of it and a second conspiracy count that has been put against them, they could be facing up to 25 years in prison. So, as is always the case, you ask the neighbor, he was a good boy. He's a very good boy. Love that Howie Carr. Plays that little bit all of the time. But the couple's neighbors said, they're goofy, normal types of people. Never expected that. But these are part of a real change that we've been seeing over the last few years into investigations in the cryptocurrency field. Now, remember, crypto isn't necessarily the best thing. I don't own any, never have owned any. I played around with some mining stuff at one point just on my regular computer to see what it was all about. But it is not anything that's worth anything to any, frankly, what I did. Now, a lot of people have been buying it. Of course, part of the problem with it is in order for it to be truly useful, you have to convert it back into something like a US dollar or maybe some other type of currency. And that's often when people get caught. And nowadays on the tax forms, it even asks you about any sort of crypto holdings that you might have. So remember all of that. They don't know, by the way, this is again from the article in the New York Times, if they were directly involved in this breach all those years ago, but this is really crypto culture and it really is the fringe. And they went crazy online and started looking at the digital trail. Her videos suddenly shared widely online. Yeah, they've become infamous is the right way to put all of that. Hey, if you like the show, I would really encourage you to follow me. You can listen to my podcast on TuneIn, on any of the major, in fact, streaming platforms out there. SoundCloud, you'll find me on Apple, etc. And I just started videotaping the shows. Last week and this week. I've done little things before, but now I'm trying to do the whole show. So you can watch me on the show as I'm recording it live and see a little bit behind the scenes, which I've always liked. I've been watching Howie Carr and Grace Curley do their show, and I thought it's well worth it. This week, I did a little bit of editing, cut out some of the in-between because I had some longer coughing fits and had to stretch my legs a couple of times. But you get to see the whole thing behind the scenes. And if you sign up for my newsletter, you're going to get my weekly trainings. You're going to find out about boot camps I'm doing and other things. But you have to sign up. Go to craigpeterson.com. You'll see it right there on any page. Frankly, just scroll down a little bit. It'll pop up right at the top of the page. Put in your name and email address, and I'm going to send you a few special reports, including my report on passwords. craigpeterson.com. You obviously know about the Great Resignation. It has been a big problem for a lot of companies out there. Great for job seekers, great for you if you're trying to maybe get a raise, etc., especially if you're in the tech industry. This Great Resignation thing, man, has it hit companies in the butt. And one of the biggest problems companies are having is with tech workers. You might remember back in the day, we had a big shortage of some of the cybersecurity people, right? Where we couldn't find them. There were numbers saying that there's like 1.5 million or more open jobs for cybersecurity people. Now, I did a little investigation into that number because it sounded high to me because I was quoting it. It was a number that came from some pretty reasonable sources. But I think this is one of those things where you had one news source stating it, and then all of a sudden other people started quoting it. I don't think it was really 1.5 million. And what I found was that the people that had put that number together were looking at it and saying, if you have a business, who should you have working for you when it comes to cybersecurity? So there's like the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, which is something I do on a fractional basis for businesses all of the time, helping them to up their security. So that you had to have a CISO, you needed to have a team looking at the logs that was paying attention to the networks. If something happened, they would know and they'd investigate, and maybe they would do patching, close bugs, which is a different person. One is the network operations center people, and if you're going to have a 24/7 network operations center, that means you need at least 4 people, probably. And so they added all of this stuff up, right? The desktop people that are making sure the endpoints are protected and kept up to date and upgraded. That's how they came up with that 1.5–2 million open jobs in the U.S. for technology. The reality was different, obviously. And now with the Great Resignation, where all of these people are out of the jobs. And part of the problem was right at the beginning of the lockdowns, they had people suspended. They laid them off, or they said, okay, maybe we'll have you back. It's only 2 weeks to flatten the curve. So yeah, take a couple of weeks off. And so that gave people the opportunity over that 2-week period, which actually was 2 years, right? Maybe it's just my imagination. I'm not sure. But that whole flatten the curve period that lasted for 2 years, people said, I don't like this job because, frankly, there is very few jobs. There are very few jobs that are as stressful as the cybersecurity jobs, because you're dealing all of the time with the senior executive saying, well, I'm not going to do this double login. I'm not going to carry a token around with me. I'm not going to have my screen time out after 15 minutes or 5 minutes. No, it has to be half an hour. I just can't get my work done otherwise. So you're fighting with senior management who approved the budget in the first place to at least do the minimal stuff. You're fighting with senior management to get the budget you need in order to keep the company safe. Because nowadays, if you're not keeping a company safe, you can go out of business like that, lose your reputation, lose your intellectual property. I've seen it before with companies, small companies, bigger companies. You've got to make sure all of your backups are in place. You're using at least a 3-2-1 strategy. Nowadays, it's more of a 4-3-2-2-1-1-0-0 strategy. I'll have to do a webinar on that one, or a little meeting. We'll get together and talk about it. But again, if you're interested in that, you got to go to my website and sign up for the email list, craigpeterson.com. Anyhow, just trying to figure it all out is difficult. And then you get all of these false alerts from software, and you got to figure out, was this a legitimate alert? Was this a false alert? What should I do about this? What should I do about that? Who's really trying to break in? Why are they trying to break in? All of that sort of stuff gets to be difficult. So it's a stressful job. So a lot of people that were in cybersecurity at the beginning of the lockdown left. They said, I got to find something better. I know a couple of listeners who decided at the age of 55 to 60, in both cases, that they would go change their careers, had enough of what they were doing, and were going to go into cybersecurity, took some of these classes, got the basics together, and found jobs in cybersecurity. Now, they're not going to be experts, but they certainly knew more than the other people at the business, including the IT directors. And I say that with air quotes. So they both changed jobs during the lockdown. Now, that's an interesting thing to me, because I'm not pointing my finger at either one of these guys, but the number one thing you have, if you are in cybersecurity, if you are a CISO, is the top drawer of your desk, assuming you have a desk. There's two things. One is your resume, and the other is your resignation letter. Because ultimately, any business can be hacked. Now, I don't want people to say, I'm throwing my hands up, because it doesn't matter. Any business can be hacked. I'm not going to deal with this, right? Why would I spend any money on it? Well, because you can control how likely you are to be hacked, and you can get like a 98 to 100% effectiveness depending on how you measure things. And if something does happen, what matters is how can you recover? So if you look at things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, you'll see there's all kinds of provisions in there to make sure the business survives a hack. Okay, so stuff you need to do, stuff you need to be concerned about. But the whole cybersecurity side of the business is still in high demand, because businesses more and more are realizing they can't just get by with running antivirus software anymore. You can't just say, oh, I've got wonderful Windows Defender on my PC, and that's working great. I don't need anything else. Now you have to have a much more advanced system. There's no two ways about it. So what we're finding is people in the IT business right now can find a job if they want it. Great article here. Let me show you a little bit. If you're watching, you'll see this on the screen. Two articles this week that I thought were really great, and I want to run through a little bit. But one is from Wired. Wired magazine. That's a magazine I've subscribed to for a long time. They got some crazy ideas, but they got some good stuff too. And it's talking about the shortage of qualified workers and the competition. It's fascinating. And then another one here I'll show you from the New York Times magazine. And it's talking about the recruiters who are trying to recruit in the tech space. Now, in both of these cases, what we're talking about are job vacancies that are open in the minimum hundreds of thousands in the U.S. right now. Yeah, it's hard to tell. But what you can tell and what we are seeing is that these recruiters who used to be stalked, quite literally sometimes, by people looking for a job, are now lucky if they get a return email or a phone call. That's how bad it's gotten for them. And the story goes through this one recruiter's kind of background saying, yeah, I had this one person who's looking for a job, and they stalked me, found my picture on LinkedIn, and then stood outside the building waiting for me to come out, and then basically shoved the resume in my face and talked me up. Another one saying, I had mentioned on the phone that I really like toffee. What shows up the next morning? This beautiful handmade toffee, perfectly wrapped. So it has gone in just a few years from that, where people will do anything in order to try and get a hold of the hiring manager, to where it is today, where people are just saying, forget about it. It isn't worth my time. The other thing that the recruiters are finding is that people, if they do get a hold of them, are saying basically, hey, I'm just burned out. I don't think I have the energy anymore to do this, which is an interesting response. People, because of the lockdown, have just had their excitement squashed and ability to look forward to what my career is going to be if you're younger. And if you're older like I am, you're looking at it saying, I've still got a lot of good years left, and I'd love to do this and have my wisdom, if you will, from all of these decades in the IT world and in cybersecurity put to good use, which is why I said I'm doing the fractional Chief Information Security Officer for businesses. But what we are finding is that people can get the jobs, even people who are already retired or semi-retired. I read another article this week that I thought was rather interesting. We'll talk about that a bit when we get back, because it's going to take a few. But about the resume side of things. Now, we heard that, of course, the toffee trick, the standing outside and stalking them trick, etc. So what is happening right now when you want a job and maybe you've been in the market before for a lot of years, and you're competing against the kids that are out there? Things have changed. Stick around and visit me online, craigpeterson.com. We're going to finish up our discussion about jobs and open IT positions, IT in general, and also going to talk about some of the tips for older employees on the resume. I had a bit of a shocker this week. This article, and I'm going to pull it up on my screen for those who are watching online, is, I think, fascinating. This is from the New York Times, and it's talking about recruiters, and it's from a recruiter's perspective, frankly. And it's saying here, this is, by the way, the one that had that story about the lady that used to be just hunted down all of the time. But it's saying recruiters are in such a demand that they too are scarce, which means their fees have never been higher. In-house tech recruiter salaries are up about 30%. Organizations looking for help in cloud and cybersecurity positions have increased fees they are offering to recruiting services to as high as 45% of the first year's salary. Isn't that something? That's Robert Half. I should have them on the show again. They have been on a few times in the past. This particular lady who left her job where she was always being courted and started freelance recruiting before the lockdown back in 2018. But their big challenges are, frankly, going beyond finding just regular humans. The New York Times says, as the people are talking to potential hires, recruiters have a big picture view of just how quickly the market is moving. And they've got to, of course, take that and translate it into something that hiring managers would understand. And that's a fine line between, hey, I'm trying to help you out here. You really should pay attention. And this is a hard sell, right? So it's a really interesting line. And we're also finding that, of course, the candidates themselves are getting a lot of money. Salaries are way up, and for a good reason. People are in demand, especially if you have the skills, and so many people just don't want to work anymore. I have a couple of ways I've looked at this over the years. I have what I call the McDonald's test. I don't think I've been to McDonald's in more than a year, and I was on a road trip at the time. But it's how good is the service at McDonald's? Because if typically the service at whatever retail store you go to is pretty good, it usually means, wow, people are looking for jobs. And it's hard to find a job. So you've got basically overqualified people working there. On the other end, if people who are working in the customer service retail space, which unfortunately, that's your face, that's your company, the people that answer the phone or that talk to your customers, those are the people who are out front. So in dealing with those people, are they the best or the worst if there are a lot of open positions? Well, typically, and I hate to say this, but typically they're not your best employees. So that's kind of my McDonald's test. Did I get great service at McDonald's or Wendy or Burger King or at the mall, or did I not get great service? And right now, we're not getting great service at any of those sorts of places. It's actually been more than a little frustrating sometimes. Even at the local coffee shop, it's been a little frustrating. The other thing, this has surprised me. This was this week, right? Now, I've never been ageist. In other words, ageist. In other words, it doesn't matter to me if someone's younger or older. Certainly, you can get to an age where there's senility. There are other obvious problems with mental function. Look at President Biden, frankly, and some of the issues he has, at least from time to time. But other than that, I never have. So I was really surprised when I was reading an article this week. And it was talking about your resume if you want to get hired. And I'm going to run through some tips here because I spent some time doing some more research on this. But you guys know I'm not a spring chicken. I'm not an old man. The brain's obviously functioning just fine. And that's a good thing. Probably will be well into my 80s, hopefully 90s. That's been the history in my family. You're 60 years old, even 70 years old, you still got a lot of good years left in you. So when I'm looking at this and saying, okay, what I do is what's called a fractional CISO. Fractional Chief Information Security Officer for businesses. So what I do is I go into a business part-time because I limit myself to somewhere between 3 and 4 customers at a time. And I have a team behind me that helps with all of the paperwork, the documentation for all the compliance and everything else that's out there. And as I'm doing all of this stuff for the company, I'm bringing them in compliance with the cybersecurity regulations. And in a lot of industries, if you're not in compliance, you're in big trouble. Okay, that makes sense, I think, to most people. So I was thinking, okay, how can I promote my fractional Chief Information Security Officer stuff? I tidied up a little bit of my LinkedIn page. I really got to get some stuff together on my Craig Peterson page and Mainstream page as well, which is my company. But I've done what I've done. So I started doing a little research, saying what sort of stuff should I have out there on LinkedIn or other places. And this is where I really got surprised. And this is where the ageist stuff comes in. And that is everybody, and I did a whole bunch more research on this. Not everybody says, if you're older, Do not even put dates on the resume of when you did things. Don't put anything on the resume that's more than 10 or 15 years old. And if you've got experience from back then, like I do, I could go in and be a COBOL programmer today. I did a lot of COBOL coding back in the 70s. IBM assembler, I did a lot of that. I even did 6502 assembler, for those that might remember that chip. And I've done a lot of kernel work over the years. C is my language of choice and was for years, as I maintained and developed code for Unix kernels. So all of that stuff out the window. And what you do is you put it under additional experience. And even if you're saying, hey, listen, I've been doing this, like I've mentioned you guys before, that I have, over 35 years of cybersecurity experience. And it's legit, right? You guys know I've been helping to develop the internet since the early 1980s. Like 81 is when I got going a little bit, and 83 is when I was into it pretty much full time. But apparently that's a no-no nowadays. So instead of saying, hey, listen, I've got 40 years of, actually, I've got closer to 45. I started in 75, I think it was, in networking. IBM networking, the old RJE and stuff. That's a no. I should say 10 plus years of computer network experience. Because apparently what's been happening is these machine learning tools that hiring managers are using are ageist. Now, businesses are using them because of this problem we just talked about here from the New York Times. Recruiters are even getting hard to find and hard to keep. And employees are, in some towns, some cities, wages are up 10% in the IT area, just in general, let alone cybersecurity. So you've got to go through automated systems now as opposed to a person. Now, it's always been tough dealing with HR because HR, they don't know the business. They certainly don't know the jobs. They just got some bullet points, outlines that they're working from. So we'll talk about this more when we get back. I'm going to go through some points here. Corn Ferry and others have a lot of good points. And as I said, we should probably try and get Robert Half on at some point. They're local here. So anyways, visit me online. Sign up right now, craigpeterson.com, and stick around because we've got a lot more to go. We talked a little bit about the jobs, what it looks like out there, what recruiters are doing. I'm going to review here now the resumes. Really, what should you have on them, particularly if you're a little bit older, like me? New York Times, great article about this, and I am also going to show you this other little article from Wired here. We're going to go full screen for those of you watching here online. But the tech companies are really getting desperate. This is a chief economist over at Deutsche Bank, published in a report saying that people are resigning at the highest rate since 2009. Huge numbers are leaving the labor market entirely, and more than 80% do not want a job. The highest on record since 1993. That's absolutely amazing looking at these numbers. So this whole great resignation, as it's called, has really widened the gap. Let me make this text a little bigger for you guys. And there have been some huge gaping holes in the workforce out there. IT in general is really looking for people, big time. Cybersecurity also looking for people. And I'm in the process right now of hiring a couple more. And let me tell you, it's more difficult than it's ever been before. In IT alone, this is according to Wired, 31% of workers actively sought out a new job between July and September last year. That's the highest amongst all industries, according to Gartner, guys that make all these studies that they sell to businesses. Data from Global Knowledge found 76% of global IT decision makers are dealing with critical skills gaps on their teams. Multiply that problem across other tech roles, and it's clear that there's a massive skills shortage. And it's just amazing. They have now sign-on bonuses on top of sign-on bonuses. They're trying to prove, hey, we got better snacks than Facebook does out there in the Bay Area, California. They're having people working from home now. It's, hey, if you want to work from home, you can. Most people are. One of my sons just got a job. He's performing kind of a CISO function like I do. He's worked with me for more than 10 years. And he is just working from home. He's never actually stepped foot in the office. And he has been doing everything virtual, including the whole interviewing process. Absolutely amazing. So they're calling this stuff a golden hello. People in the business are already saying, hey, I didn't get one of those. Yeah, because you've been working there for 5 years. But everyone internally recognizes it's an unusual situation, and for us to continue to grow, we need to be extra competitive. There's sign-on bonuses, and they found those have not been effective in the IT world because candidates are looking to maximize the opportunity to get much higher salaries elsewhere. Now, I did a proposal. I'm working with a company right now, and I did a proposal for them to provide some of these fractional chief information security officer functions. I'm helping to define where they need to go, how they need to get there. I'm doing all the documentation on everything. I'm working on the HR policies, everything, including securing the networks, helping them get the hardware, running it, renting them stuff right off the bat so that they can secure themselves very quickly. A whole bunch of stuff that I'm doing for them. And frankly, I think it makes a lot of sense. But how could they possibly hire somebody like me? How could they hire someone like my son? So I went online to Glassdoor. You might know about that website, glassdoor.com. It lets you check out businesses, what jobs might they have open, and look at reviews from an employee standpoint of a company. Glassdoor is pretty good for that. And I looked at salaries. Right now, somebody like me that is a CISO makes between $250,000 and $900,000 a year, depending on the size of the company. Now, that's real money. Last time I checked, even with the inflation that we're looking at right now. I don't know. Maybe I won't keep up with it. I saw some inflation numbers. Of course, they moved these out of the consumer price index because it would make it look bad. But some of these inflation numbers are over 20%. It's just nuts. So thanks to salary, $250,000 to just shy of $900,000 a year salary, plus load, which you have to add normally, about 30%. And then plus all the equipment, plus the CISO needs a team, everything else. This is a huge problem. And they need to be hiring people to fill those jobs. These are just amazing. Permanent remote positions in the U.S. doubled from 9% to 18% during the last quarter of 2021. Doubled in the last quarter of last year. Ladders and online jobs, this is according to Ladders, okay? And it could increase to 25% by 2020. Since making the transition to remote first, we have been able to broaden our hiring options globally and not be restricted to a talent pool in one area. Now, that's an interesting thing, too, and that presents some interesting problems. It's one thing to manage people who are of the same upbringing as you are, that have the same standards that you are, and hiring somebody from somewhere else in the world, they're going to have different expectations. And boy, have I found that by hiring teams in India, Russia, and the Philippines, as well as the U.S. Big differences. So you got to be careful with all that. Okay, so I promised I would get here into resumes for people like us, right? Isn't that what they say? And this is particularly interesting to me because, again, I'm still working, and I do it on a contract basis, obviously. I provide these services. This is something I think that applies to me, too. So I'm pulling up a page you can see on the screen This is from themuse.com, and it's called Smart Moves Age-Proof Resumes for Older Workers, okay? And they have 4 of them set up, and they got a nice picture of a lady, looks like she's working from home. With age comes wisdom and experience. That's why I was shocked when I saw what was going on, right, where they were going ahead and saying, don't put anything on your resume that makes it look like you're older, okay? The quote here is, ageism is an unfortunate and very real part of the job search for older workers. And for some, it can start to creep into their experience as early as their 40s. Isn't that incredible? Absolutely incredible. I kind of dealt with this way back when in the 80s because I was younger then, obviously, than I am now. And there's this impression, at least there was, and it seems to still be around, that somehow if you're working with newer technologies, you need young people to do it. That is not true. As I've said a million times, there's only a few ways that you can code something. So if you're a programmer and you want to solve a problem, there's really only a few ways to do it. In fact, there's books published with algorithms, that's the program stuff, right? The core of the programming, that show you how to do things. So we'll be back in just a minute. Take a minute, visit me online, craigpeterson.com. I'd love to see you there. And when we get back, we're going to finish this discussion. But it's an important one for employers as well as employees here, because I think many businesses are making a huge mistake. craigpeterson.com. We just talked some more about hiring, ageism, the problems that come with that for both the employer and the employee. And we're going to get now more into this from the Muse. We're going to talk about the 4 things you should be doing with your resume. There's a lot to be said for having experience. I mentioned about how businesses who are hiring programmers should really rethink the idea of hiring the young guy that knows the latest programming languages. Because again, there are so many things that you need to know besides how do you code this line. It's what Google did for many years, probably still does. They don't want you to necessarily write a program in Go, which is Google's latest cool language, but they want you to solve a problem. They want to see your problem-solving skills. How are you going to do it? Nobody has more skills than someone that's been doing that for decades. Again, there's only so many ways to program something. I don't care what language you're using. We used to have a saying, you can write COBOL in any language. But it's true. That's why we used to say that. So when it comes to IT in general, the older the person is, the more experience they have in the field, the better off they're going to be with your company. Because again, there's only so many ways to break into a computer. Yeah, there's the latest, greatest virus out there. But managing people, managing expectations, working with senior staff, doing presentations for investors, that's the sort of thing that takes experience. How do you get that experience? There's only one way, and that's to get the experience. It takes time. Learning a new programming language for a programmer, not a big deal at all. Again, there's only so many ways to do something. And a programmer like me that's done a lot, written hundreds of thousands of lines of code in at least a dozen computer languages, picking up a new language is easy. I picked up Python and was able to be programming in it using APIs online, all of the newest ways of programming and interfacing with other back-end systems. I was able to write something that was putting together a whole bunch of cybersecurity stuff from scratch in the matter of a couple of hours on a language I'd never used before. Okay? So how do you deal with that? It's the question of the hour, right? So let's have a look at this article here from the Muse. They've got some suggestions for us here. You know, if you've been in the workplace for decades, you've got a lot of experience, but putting it all down can be a real liability. I remember I used to have a dossier. I had a resume, which was like a one-pager. Then I had a dossier that went on for 30 plus pages of all the things I had done. I wrote some of the very first, I designed and implemented and used for a customer some of the very first firewalls ever made, routers, load sharing. But do I want to put that all on the resume? Probably not, but I understand that technology extremely well. So resumes don't have to be a single page, but it's saying, remember, it doesn't have to be a memoir. It doesn't have to be like my dossier going through everything to prove your worth. And what they're saying here specific, this is a Gary Sussman, it's just a marketing tool whose sole purpose is to land you an interview. It doesn't have to be exhaustive and comprehensive, just has to show that you can solve the problem the hiring manager is hiring someone to solve. And the beauty right now, again, if you're in the IT, if you're in cybersecurity, is they need people. So it's going to be easier to get through. And if you are an older person who has learned a bit about cybersecurity, maybe taken an online course or two, you have a much better job or chance of getting hired for a job than you probably have ever had. Okay. It goes on and on. Employers are most interested in how your recent work ties back to the job that you're applying for rather than your experience 15 years ago. Okay, that makes sense. So dedicate more resume space to detailing the positions you've held over the past 10 to 15 years that are related to the job. Number 2, do not date yourself. Now, I mentioned earlier in the show that most businesses now are using some form of machine learning. Call it artificial intelligence, whatever you might want to call it. But they are doing the initial cut. So they're looking for buzzwords, that's for sure, okay? And what they're also looking for is saying, okay, this guy's got more than 10 years experience. He's got 35 years or 45 years of experience in this. So do we want to hire them, or are they just burned out? They don't want to do it anymore. What we're finding is the younger kids are definitely burned out. Older people, not so much. We do what we love to do, no matter your age here. So Sussman explains that when he included his number of years of experience, hiring managers told him he was too qualified, which he interpreted to mean they couldn't afford to pay someone his age what his skills and experience were worth. He had better luck when he focused on more recent experience and made his age less obvious. And if you've earned any professional certifications, don't list the year the certificate was earned, but do provide the expiration date on those certificates, okay? While including a role you held or diploma you earned 2 decades ago are obvious signs you're an older worker, there's other subtle clues. Older professionals are sometimes as lacking technology savvy. Do you guys think that I lack technology savvy, right? No. When the FBI InfraGard program needed someone who knew technology, could run technology, and run their training programs, who did they turn to? The FBI InfraGard program turned to me, okay? So these sorts of assumptions many people are making are dead wrong. I made sure there's no indication of my age on my resume, no mention of my graduation year, no old school email addresses. If you have AOL, Yahoo, Hotmail, ditch it. Open a Gmail account. Once you've gotten that new email address, add it to the top of your resume along with your mobile phone number and the URL to your LinkedIn profile. That's how they're hiring nowadays. You don't really need to put your physical address in anymore. You could put in your city and state, but remember, after the lockdown, a lot of people are working remotely, and a lot of people have taken jobs and have never even gone to the office. And I used my son as that example earlier. He recommends removing all mention of outdated or standard software knowledge. Now, this is an interesting point and a potential problem. I mentioned earlier that I did a lot of COBOL programming back in the day, a lot for banks, market research companies, and others. We were so into COBOL, we wrote an assembler in COBOL. Okay, if you know what that means, that's the opposite of what you normally would do. Here's the issue that I want to bring up. There are still COBOL applications out there, and it is very hard to find somebody that wants to write in one of these older programming languages or maintain some of these older programming languages, okay? So that's a catch-22 there. Lean into your resume gaps. It says, whereas some older workers have to overcome the perception that they have too much experience, others need to explain a gap in your resume. If you stepped out of the workforce to raise children or care for parents or have been unemployed due to layoffs, you might be wondering, how do you handle it? Hiring managers are familiar with resume gaps, so it's not necessarily a cause. So what he's saying here is put volunteer experience into the gaps. So you were helping somebody out, maybe you worked in a family business. There's things like that are not negatives. Highlight your achievements. This is the main thing here, okay? I've seen this again and again. Older workers might feel intimidated about the job search process, but you've got a credible ace in the hole that you can confidently present database examples of how you've delivered impressive benefits and solutions for your employers over the span of your career. This is true for everybody. I don't care if you are 20 years old entering the labor market or if you are 80 years old still in the labor market. Letting them know your successes, what you've done. So for instance, for me, as a fractional Chief Information Security Officer, I can talk about all of the companies that I've done incredible work for and what it's meant to them. In some cases, I have saved them from the brink of bankruptcy because of money stolen from operating accounts and because of ransomware and other types of malware, intellectual property theft, just on and on. So he gives an example here I think is pretty good. He says, instead of saying responsible for marketing materials and event promotion, say created marketing materials and promoted events through social media, boosting attendance by 80% over a 6-month period. So you see what he's doing there? Instead of responsible for keeping records to track contractor costs, say developed and implemented a new record-keeping system, saving the company $12,000 per year in contract costs. You might include summary statements. I've always done that at the top of the resumes to outline what it is I do, what I can do for them. This whole thing, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. It's a little disconcerting when you're trying to do a job search. I know that just watching some of my kids just get looked over. I have another one that's pretty high up in a business, and she's been overlooked. She's applied for jobs and came down to the last 2 people. She was one of the people, and I think the last 3 times she was overlooked. So you got to be careful of that. And also, because there's so much money out there right now for people that are hiring, work hard to keep the employees you have. That's it for today. Make sure you visit me online, craigpeterson.com. If you have any questions, I'm more than glad to answer them. I get emails every day, me@craigpeterson.com, and I'd be glad to help fill in the gaps. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.